Welcome to Grace this weekend. My name is Daniel. I have the privilege of leading the young adult ministry here at Grace. And if I have not had the opportunity to meet you before, I'm glad to introduce myself to you tonight. I'm really excited that you're here with us this weekend. In fact, I think that our time together is going to be really beneficial. We've been in this series here at Grace over the last handful of weeks now called Parables. And throughout this series, we've been doing what the title of the series is. We've been looking at the parables in the Bible. And parables are these short, little, simple stories that Jesus often taught in, and they all have really deep, profound truths. And every one of the weeks in this series, all the parables that we have looked at throughout this series, have been very broad. We've had a ton of different conversations, and not all of them flow together, and they're all kind of like standalone little conversations. But there's been this phrase that if you've been paying attention, if you've been here throughout all the weeks in this series, there's this phrase that keeps coming up in the parable. It hasn't been in all of them, and it certainly isn't in the rest of the ones that we will look at, but it's a phrase that I think is worth us spending a little bit on time unpacking, and then we'll get into the rest of our conversation tonight. The phrase that keeps coming up in these parables is a phrase that goes like this: the kingdom of heaven is like, or the kingdom of heaven. And the question that we should ask in understanding these parables and understanding that is, what is the kingdom of heaven? We've talked about that idea, we've talked about that principle, we've used that phrase, but we never have really defined it. And part of the reason we don't explicitly define it every week and every time that it comes up is because when the kingdom of heaven is used as a phrase, it doesn't always mean the same thing. But that's going to show up in our parable tonight. So I want to give us a working definition for the sake of our conversation tonight. How I would define the kingdom of heaven is this. You can see it in your notes. Really, the kingdom of heaven boiled down is two things. It's life in him and life his way. Life in him and life his way. The question, it might seem obvious, but who is the him? The him is Jesus. And so when Jesus says the kingdom of heaven is like, what he's talking about is life in him is like. If you're part of the kingdom of heaven, it means you have life in Jesus. It means you have a relationship with Jesus. Part of the kingdom of heaven is the people who would call themselves Christians, the people who have a relationship with God, which means if you're a follower of Jesus, you're part of the kingdom of heaven. And part of being part of the kingdom of heaven means you have life with Jesus. Means you have life in him. Now, if you're in his kingdom, the kingdom is his, which means he's the king. And if we're part of his kingdom, it means that being part of that kingdom, we listen to the king, which is life his way. That sometimes when Jesus uses the phrase, the kingdom of heaven is like, what he's actually trying to get us to understand is when we live life his way, here's what happens. When we live life the way that he would call us to live, this is what turns out, or this is what happens. Now, we'll come back to this definition. We'll use it a bunch for the sake of our conversation tonight. But I want to have this conversation with us, and I figured the best way to get into our conversation tonight is to talk about something that we all love right now, and it's the word inflation. I figured I'd start by making everybody mad, and that would be the best way to get into our conversation tonight. Inflation is real. We know inflation is all around us. To be honest, I've noticed inflation's a big deal. Every time I get my electric bill, I'm like, man, inflation's real. Like, this is way more expensive than it used to be. And you probably have recognized that, and you realize that stuff is a little bit more expensive right now. But inflation hit me in the face the other day for like the very first time, and I actually like felt myself getting like physically frustrated and mad about it. Let me tell you the story. My wife and I were at home one evening, and it was still a little bit early in the evening, and my wife was getting dinner ready, and she said, Daniel, I need some produce still for dinner. I think she needed some like tomatoes and that kind of stuff. And so she said, why don't we just go to the farmer's market and we'll get the produce that we need for dinner. Now, if you know farmer's markets, they're already a little bit inherently more expensive. And we were trying to be pretty like tight with our budget, so I said, all right, we can go to the farmer's market, we can get produce, but we can't spend more than $15. Now, if you think $15 to me sounded like, oh, we'll be able to get everything we need. We just needed some produce. You might think, oh, maybe you'll get some corn and some onions and some tomatoes and all that kind of stuff. Well, let me show you. We didn't quite hit $15. We hit $14. Let me show you what $14 gets you at a farmer's market in 2024. I was so mad, I took a picture of it. And here's what we got at the farmer's market for $14. 2 tomatoes and a peach. 2 tomatoes and a peach for $14. It was $18, and we put 1 peach back because we were like, we're not going over our budget. I thought this was so funny. I was like, my son or my grandson is going to ask me what it was like to live in 2024, and I'm going to pull this picture up as evidence of what it was like. But here's just the truth. We know inflation's real, and it's frustrating. In fact, I said it to you this way in your notes, that everything right now just seems overpriced and overvalued. Everything right now just seems overpriced and overvalued. Like maybe for the very first time in human history, cars actually went up in value over the last couple years. Some of us, we had like a truck in our garage, and we didn't know it, but we were actually parking gold bars in our garage because trucks were like a hot commodity there for a little while. You've probably seen the videos of people who go to the store and they get like the same grocery order that they got 3 years ago, and the price went from like $80 to $200. When I was a kid, I remember going to the grocery store. If we spent over $100, it was like, man, we're coming home with everything. I probably had all the cereal that I wanted. I can't sneeze in the Kroger parking lot today without spending $100. It is absolutely insane. It's the world that we live in. Everything seems overpriced and overvalued. And it's not just inflation. We've created a new word to talk about when things stay the same price, but you get less of that thing. It's called shrinkflation. Shrinkflation is when, the price tag looks the same, but they've just put less stuff in the package to keep us at the same value. And here's the deal. We can laugh, we can get angry, we can commiserate about inflation, but I actually think it's doing something to us. Like it's actually changing the way that we process things because we're in this environment where it seems like everything has just become so overpriced and so overvalued. It's changing the way that we process. And if we're really honest, this is what our experience in an inflation world actually has led us to. Here's what's true, that our experience has left us skeptical and cynical. Our experience has left us skeptical and cynical. It's not just that we're sad or frustrated that things are more expensive. Now, like, all of our guards are up. When we go somewhere and someone starts talking to us about value of something or worth of something or price of something, our immediate response is, no, hold on. You're not going to dupe me. Like, you're not going to take advantage of me. I know my guards are up. I'm going to make sure that I'm alert, that I'm sober-minded, that I'm not going to go accidentally buy something that's not actually worth the price. This is why when you go on vacation and they try to talk to you about the timeshare, your guards are up. Because we're skeptical. We're cynical of whether or not things are actually worth it. I don't know this is so me, but I go out of my way to avoid the DirecTV or the T-Mobile salesperson at Sam's Club because I'm not going to get taken advantage of. Not a chance. This is why your neighborhood Facebook page blows up when the door-to-door salesperson is going around because everyone's like, watch out, don't get taken advantage of, don't get duped. Why? Because we live in this environment right now where our experiences have made us skeptical and cynical of value propositions. And here's why we're talking about that this weekend. Because we don't just live our life in that environment and then like when we show up at church, that environment is exempt from that process. When you show up at church, the same thing is true. We start talking about the value and worth of like living with Jesus, and to be honest, we're skeptical. We're cynical. We ask ourselves the question, is that life really worth it? In fact, some of us, man, we walk into church, and if this is you this weekend, I'm so glad that you're here, but you walk into church and you view the person like me who gets up here and preaches on any given weekend like I'm here trying to sell you something. And so you sit there with your arms crossed and you're like, no way, I'm not going to get duped. I'm not going to get taken advantage of. You can talk all you want about the value of Jesus, but I bet you, Daniel, that I could get all the benefits that you talk to me about the life of Jesus and what he has to offer, and I bet you I can get it at a cheaper price than what you think it might be worth. I bet I can get all the value that's associated with following Jesus and not really have that much change about how I live. And for some of us, if we're really honest and we process like the value of following Jesus, our thought process has become, how can I make sure like I get into heaven someday and do as little work as possible to get there? Because we live in this world where everyone promises us that they're the next best thing and that they're worth it and they're valuable. And then we show up at church and Christians do the same thing. Jesus is worth it. Jesus is valuable. And when we're really honest, we have to wrestle with the idea that our default nature is to say, I want all the stuff that you are telling me about, but I don't really want to pay the price to get it. In fact, I think the best value would be if I could pay as little as possible to get the same thing that you might be talking about. And if I could, I would just say that I actually think to find value in something, specifically maybe in this conversation about Jesus and Christianity and all that kind of stuff, if the value's really there, the question that we shouldn't be asking is, how can I do as little work as possible to get that value? The question that we should actually ask is, if that thing is really that valuable, how do I make sure I get as much of it as possible? Not how do I work as little as possible, how do I get as much of it as possible? And here's the beauty of the parables. When Jesus shares the parable that we're going to be in tonight, he talks about both of those ideas. He talks about the value that is associated with following him, and he also talks about the cost that's associated with us receiving that value. So here's what we're going to do. We're going to go to a parable where Jesus talks about this idea, and we're going to unpack what he has to say about what life in him and life his way is actually worth. So if you have your Bible, you can go to Matthew chapter 13. If you have your phone, you can pull it up. If you don't have either of those things, the verses will be up on the screen. Matthew 13, we'll start in verse 44. And it says this. It starts by saying, the kingdom of heaven is like. Now, there's that phrase. Pop quiz, what's the definition of the kingdom of heaven that we're working with tonight? Life in him and life his way. Life in him and life his way. The kingdom of heaven is like. Now, when we just say it, the kingdom of heaven is like, that doesn't make much sense to us. But if we substitute it and say, life in him and life his way, it's like this. Then all of a sudden, when Jesus starts to unpack what it's actually like, it makes a little bit more sense because we're thinking, okay, life Jesus' way, life with him, this is how it looks. And here he goes explaining how life in him and life his way looks. Life with him and life his way is like a treasure that's hidden in the field. It's like a treasure that's hidden in the field. All of a sudden, we start to already unpack the value that Jesus would associate with following him. It says it's a treasure, but it's not just a treasure that's like up on a pedestal somewhere. It's not in the middle of a field with like a neon sign pointing straight to it or a billboard that says treasure this way. It's treasure that's hidden. We don't know what hidden means. It could mean that it's buried in a field. It could mean that it's out in the field with like a blanket over it or something like that. We don't know exactly what it means, but Jesus says, life with me. Life in my kingdom, life my way. It's a treasure that's been hidden in a field. And it talks about what happens when someone finds that treasure. It goes on to say, when a man found it, he hid it again. And then in his joy, he went and he sold all that he had and he bought that field. Here's a guy stumbling through life. I don't know if he's on his morning jog. I don't know what he's doing in a field. He's probably trespassing. I mean, if he lived in America, he's trespassing. But he's in a field. He's walking through this field and he trips or he comes across a blanket in the field and moves it and he finds a treasure chest. He opens up the treasure chest. He sees it's full of gold. And he's like, oh my goodness, this is like crazy. I've never found something like this before in my entire life. And in a moment, his default response was, man, this thing that I just found, it's insanely valuable. This thing that I just stumbled across here in this field, it's insanely valuable. And so he was like, this is the craziest day of my life. I'm full of joy. I'm so happy. I can't believe I just stumbled across this thing that is so valuable. And all the things start going in his head of like, how can I get my hands on this? Like, how can I make sure it's actually mine? So he goes home, he sells everything that he has, and in his head, he's like, if I buy the field, then the field comes with everything in the field, and I'll get the treasure. So he hides the treasure, goes, sells everything he has, comes back to the person who owns the field, and he says, can I have it? And he makes a deal, and he buys the field. I love that first illustration, and to be honest, I've been thinking about this like all week, and I can't help but think that this guy is just like the Beverly Hillbillies. If you know that show, the Beverly Hillbillies, they realized that their property had oil on it, and like overnight, they went from these people who didn't have much to these people who had insane amounts of value because they realized that on their land was treasure that was worth more than they could ever imagine. That's exactly what this guy was. Now, this guy's life changed, and it doesn't even say he set out that morning to find the treasure, but Jesus goes on to tell another version of a very similar story, very similar angle, but a different environment, and this is what he goes on to say. He says, again, the kingdom of heaven, life with him and life his way, is like a merchant that's looking for fine pearls. Now, this guy's different than the other guy because this guy sets out one morning to find fine pearls that are of great value and of great price. He goes looking for it and searching for it, trying to find something that's super valuable, and it goes on to say this, when he found one of great value, which is so funny because that's Walmart brand, and we would not associate that with like super nice stuff anymore. But great value here means a really expensive one. When he finds a really, really, really expensive one, he does what? He went away and he sold everything that he had. And he bought it. He said, I sought out to find the most valuable thing I could find, and I found it. And that thing is so valuable that I'll get rid of everything I have just so that I can have it. Now there's a lot that's going on in these short, two little stories. Both the characters in the story found something. They found something, one that they set out to find, another who kind of just stumbled upon it. And I love that the beautiful thing is when they found it, they didn't know the exact value of it. Like when the dude found the pearl, it didn't have a price tag on it that said $100.12 or something like that. They didn't know the exact value of it, but what they did know was what they had found was more valuable than anything that they had. In fact, it wasn't just more valuable than anything that they had, it was more valuable than everything that they had combined. And so they went back and they said, I have found something that is so valuable, I am willing to trade everything that I have just so that I have it. Because if I have it, then I have way more value than I had before it. So I'll trade everything to make sure that I can get my hands on this. And that is so backwards to us. It's so backwards to us because, one, we don't believe in the concept of putting all of our eggs in one basket. But putting all of our eggs in one basket is a great idea when we know that the thing we're putting our value in is greater than what we have. And it's also so backwards to us because we think value is associated with paying the cheapest price possible for something. But these guys, they show up on the scene and they say, no, that thing is so valuable that I'm not going to pay the cheapest price possible for it. I'm going to pay the highest price possible for it because there's no price that is too high that would out-trump the value of that thing that I'm going to get my hands on. And remember what Jesus is doing here. He's painting a picture of how valuable life in him and life his way actually is. And what he's saying is, if you've found me, if you've stumbled into a relationship with me, if you've searched and found a relationship with me, and if you've lived life my way, that's how valuable I am. That I'm worth everything. I'm worth more than you could even begin to imagine. That life with me, life in relationship with me, life the way that I've called you to live is so valuable that it is worth everything you have and much, much more. That's exactly what Jesus is saying. And you can imagine Jesus painting the picture of what life in him and life his way is worth. And some of the people hearing this parable that day would have not really known Jesus that well. He was in a crowd full of people, and to be honest, probably some of the people that were listening to this, they had never seen Jesus before. He was just a rumor of a guy like some carpenter from Nazareth, and he shows up on the scene, and one of the first things he tells him is, hey, if you follow me, I'm worth everything. Like, I'm the greatest value you could ever find. You could trade everything to have life with me, and that's what it's going to be worth it. And you can imagine the people hearing that would have responded a very similar way to the way that most of us respond. We're skeptical, we're cynical. The people who hear that, they're like, yeah, right, Jesus. Some dude was selling snake oil like 3 weeks ago, promising us it was the greatest value ever on planet Earth and that we should be willing to give our whole bank account for it. Jesus, you're not the first person to tell me that. And I don't really believe that life in you is really that worth it. But those people wouldn't have been the only people that heard Jesus tell that story that day. There would have been people there who were actually no stranger at all to Jesus. They were his followers. They had spent a ton of time with him. They had wandered roads with him. They had slept with Jesus under the stars in the same tents with Jesus. They had seen Jesus teach. They had seen Jesus preach. They had seen Jesus do miracles. They had gone hungry with Jesus. They had been kicked out of towns with Jesus. And when they heard Jesus tell this story, I'm sure what went off in their mind was, you know what? He's exactly right. He's exactly right. And I haven't been able to put words to it, but what he just explained is exactly right. Because one day, I was just living life. I was chilling. I was being a fisherman. I was being a tax collector. I was being whatever. And then all of a sudden, my life changed, and it felt like everything started to make sense. It felt like one day I went from here all the way over to here, and the thing that was different was I met Jesus. And I started walking with him. And I started living my life his way. And I started living my life in relationship with him. And those disciples who heard this story that day would have looked at everybody in the crowd and said, he's exactly right, believe him, it's worth it, the value's there. The kingdom of heaven is so many things. But when Jesus wants to explain to us what the value of the kingdom of heaven is, he uses a specific word. And it's the word that I want to share with us this weekend. The kingdom of heaven is a treasure. The kingdom of heaven is a treasure. The kingdom of heaven is a lot of things, but when Jesus wants you to think about its value, he wants you to remember that the kingdom of heaven is a treasure. That life in him and life his way is insanely valuable. It's the most valuable thing you could ever get your hands on. And for some of us, if we're honest, when we think about life with Jesus and life his way, treasure is not the word we use. We think, life in him and life his way, like Jesus, he's got some good teaching, he's got some good morals, he's good for my kids. But a treasure, come on. Is it worth that much? Others of us, we think, no, Daniel, he's more than a good teacher, it's more than good morals, it's more than good for my kids. My question back would be, okay, how much more to you? How much more is he really? Like your relationship with Jesus, how much more than just good morals, good teaching, and good for your kids is he really to you? Would you go so far as to say he's a treasure? I think there's some signs that actually reveal to us whether or not we value our relationship with Jesus if we call ourselves a Christian, or how much value we place on the things that Jesus would do. For some of us, it's just Jesus is probably the right thing to do. He's probably best for my life. It's probably good if I follow him. But if it's not a treasure to you, here's what will happen. If it's not a treasure to you, then the moment it becomes difficult to live life in him and to live life his way, you'll bow out. If he's not a treasure to you, if he's not that valuable to you, then the moment that someone starts to press you on, do you really believe what Jesus teaches about a specific thing? You really believe that the way Jesus talks about sex is actually the best way to talk about sex? You really believe it's the best teaching? If it's not a treasure to you, you'll cave. You'll say, I don't know, Jesus teaches a lot of good stuff. I don't really agree all the way. It's a little antiquated. It's a little bit old. If it's not a treasure to you, then you can pick and choose what things Jesus talks about to follow and what not to follow. But come on. If life in him and life his way is a treasure to you, if it's valuable to you, then it's worth sacrificing for, it's worth sharing, it's worth talking about, it's worth planning your life around, it's worth dreaming of, it's worth researching. It is the rock that everything else in your life is built on. It is the roadmap for your marriage. It becomes all you think about in all your interactions during your time in school. Every interaction, every relationship hinges on the fact that you have found something that has changed your life. If it's a treasure to you, imagine you woke up tomorrow and someone handed you $50 million. Think of all the ways your life would change. And Jesus says, that's what happens when you find me. That's what happens when you understand life in me and life my way. It is a treasure that changes your life. It is a value for you. And not just a value, it's the most valuable thing you could ever have. There's nothing you could ever get that would be more valuable than life in him and life his way. Some of us think the world needs more people who think that following Jesus is a good idea. Listen to me. The world does not change an ounce with more people who think following Jesus is a good idea. The world changes when people don't think Jesus is just a good idea, but when they recognize that following Jesus is the most valuable thing on the planet. It's worth dying for, it's worth living for, it's worth dreaming about, it's worth sharing, it's worth sacrificing for. The world doesn't change with people who think Jesus is a good idea. The world changes with people who think Jesus is a treasure. That life in him is the most valuable thing we could ever get our hands on. And that they're willing to give everything for it. This whole concept of life in Jesus and life his way being a treasure, to be honest, when we start to unpack it, it's so much deeper than we even really understand. And I actually think that this story in particular goes to show how masterful of a storyteller Jesus really is. Because in 3 short little verses, and really just a couple of sentences, he gives us so much profound truth that we have to unpack. And there's some stuff about the treasure that is the kingdom of heaven and following Jesus, life in his way, that if we really start to understand, it'll shape our whole experience about this. In fact, just in these little verses, there's a couple things that almost feel like paradoxes that Jesus talks about. And I want to unpack two of them because they shape the way that we see his treasure. The first kind of paradox in the story is this idea that the treasure, it's hidden and it's available. That the treasure that is life in Jesus and life his way, it's hidden and it's available. It's hidden and it's available. Do you remember both of the guys who set out on their journey to find the things? They had to look for it. They had to search. The first guy had to probably dig it up. It was hidden. And if life in him and his way is hidden, what does that mean? Well, first of all, it means that not everybody's going to find it. Not everybody stumbles across buried treasure. But what else it means is it's not going to make sense to everybody. If life Jesus' way is hidden, then when you start talking about it, not everybody's going to get on board. Not everybody's going to understand. And for some of you, that should actually be super comforting. Because you walk into a place like this and you're like, man, here's all these Christians talking about life in Jesus and how it's awesome and it just seems like it's clicked for them and it hasn't clicked for me. And maybe the reason it hasn't clicked for you is actually because it's hidden and you need to keep digging a little bit more. You actually need to keep searching. You've got some questions in your soul that you need to ask and you need to wrestle with before the things of Jesus start actually making sense to you. The treasure being hidden means that we've got to look for it. That it's not just going to smack us in the face someday. It's got to be something that we try to find and dig out. It's something that is hidden that needs unearthed. And for all of us, if we have recognized that Jesus is a treasure, that unearthing of the hidden treasure has happened at a different pace for every one of us. For some of us, man, it was like the first time you ever heard about life with Jesus and what he had done for you, it made sense to you, and it clicked. For others of you, when you think about your journey following Jesus and how valuable you actually think that it is, it took years and years and years and years. And like I said, there are some of us that are still in that journey, and it still doesn't quite make sense to us. But you got to search, you got to dig, you have to ask your questions. You have to maybe, for some of us, understand a lot more before it actually clicks for you. And if we're honest, some of us don't like that. Some of us don't like the idea that like life in Jesus is hidden and that it wouldn't make sense for everybody. When we think about like God and following him, some of us actually take that idea that it's hidden and that it wouldn't make sense and that people would have to search and not everybody would find it. And we actually think, man, that's kind of crazy that a God would do that. But I actually think the crazy part is not that it's hidden from us. The crazy part is actually that it would be available to us in the first place. I mean, I want us to wrap our mind around the idea and the fact that Jesus says life in him and life his way is available. Would we start to like actually paint this picture here that the creator God, the God who made the mountains rise, the God who filled the oceans, the God who paints the sunset, the God who looks and dotted the stars, the God who's the author of life, the one that the sun looks to for permission to shine in the morning, the God who is the author of life, the God who knew you by your name before your parents ever knew each other, is the same God who doesn't just know you by your name, he calls you by your name, hoping that someday you might listen for his still small voice and come to him. That God has made his kingdom available to you. And that's the crazy part of the story. Not that it's hidden from some, not that it's hard to find, not that it's something you got to search for. The crazy part of the story is that God, the God of all, the almighty, powerful creator, sustainer of life, would even let us be in relationship with him. Would even enter into our room and come to our space and say, do you know that life with me is available to you? Do you know that life my way is available to you? Do you know that I have a treasure waiting for you? When I was in college, I had a friend whose family lived in the town that we were staying in. I've talked about this family before. They really kind of adopted our friend group, and their house was just a few minutes from our campus. And I can't remember if it was the first time I ever went over to their house or pretty shortly after. Their mom looked at all my friends and she said, hey, I want to show you something. And she walked us into the basement, and there was this old, like, vintage-style refrigerator in the corner of the basement. And she said, I just want you guys to know that every time you guys come over here, this fridge is available for you. And she opened it up, and it was just full of drinks. She was like, you can take whatever you want. And I know I say drinks, like the best drink in there was a peach Snapple, not maybe the kind of drinks you're thinking about. I was not that old when I was in college. And I remember like going over to their house. One of the things that I always loved is that I could go downstairs and I could get in that fridge, didn't need to ask. I could go grab whatever I wanted. And then whenever like we would bring friends over and new people would come to the house, I'd be like, hey, come here, check this out, dude. We can go down to this fridge. We can get anything we want. They got like all the sparkly fizzy water you ever wanted. Check out the peach Snapple. They got the glass bottles, not the plastic ones. How awesome is this? And then there would be times where like a bunch of us would be over there and we'd raid the fridge. We would literally, it would start full and by the end of the night, the fridge would be empty. And I would go back like the next day. We went over there all the time. I'd go back there the next day and I would go back to that fridge and I would be like, man, we raided this fridge last night. Like there's no way there's more drinks in there. And I'd open it up, the fridge would be full again. And what I quickly learned, I could not outdrink the drink fridge. That's what I quickly learned. I was like, Diane is gonna fill this thing up and it's gonna be awesome. Every time I come over here, there's gonna be more drinks in the drink fridge. You know what's crazy about the treasure that is the kingdom of heaven? There is always more to it than you think. There is always way more value associated with following Jesus than you and I would ever think. And there are some of us that the kingdom of heaven and following Jesus and life with him and being a Christian, it was a treasure to us at one point. We followed Jesus, we heard about Jesus. We were like, man, this is crazy that this Jesus guy who is the King of heaven, this guy who is God, he would be willing to give up his life for me and he would offer his kingdom to me, that he would even make it available to me. That's insane. And it was a treasure. But if you're really honest, that treasure chest has been sitting on a shelf collecting dust for a lot of years. And what we need to do is unearth the treasure again. Go back to the kingdom of heaven. Go back to life in him. Go back to life his way and recognize, man, this Jesus guy, he's got all the value I could ever need. He's got everything I could ever ask for. Life in him and life his way is insanely valuable. It is a treasure. So keep digging through it. Keep digging through it. For some of you, you need to keep digging through it for the very first time. Keep asking your questions. You don't understand all that Jesus is. Listen, come on. I told someone this in a study not too long ago, a couple months ago. We were asking questions about faith, and this person was not a Christian, and they were wrestling with all their questions. I pulled her aside afterwards, and I said, your questions are incredible. And here's what I want to say. You can pick whatever faith system you want to in life as you're exploring it, but that faith system has to be able to answer the best questions you can throw at it. Go explore. And what I told her was, and what you're going to find is that the faith system that is life in Jesus and life his way has the best answers to the hardest questions. Keep digging. Keep asking your questions. Find someone in your life that is wiser than you, smarter than you, knows more about Jesus than you, and ask the hardest questions. Keep digging. For some of us, keep digging and unearthing the hidden treasure that is available to us means we need to start picking up our Bible again in the morning. The treasure was valuable to us at one point, but it's been collecting dust for far too long. Go back and start digging. Because it is worth it. It's not a good news thing. It's not a good works thing. It's not a good idea. It's a treasure. It's valuable. It is more valuable than anything you will ever find. The kingdom of heaven is hidden and it's available. But that's not the only paradox we see in the story. There's another one that gives us a real insight into how valuable this treasure really is. Here's the paradox. It's costly and it's priceless. It's costly and it's priceless. If we go back to the story, we got to remember that the two guys who found the thing that they thought were valuable, what did they do? They sold everything for it. They sold everything for it. They said, if I have this thing, then nothing is worth holding on to anymore. Every single thing I own is less valuable than this thing that I have found. I don't know who told you that following Jesus was 100% free, but I think they misguided you a little bit. Because following Jesus will actually cost you everything. But Ephesians chapter 2 tells us that following Jesus will cost us a lot, but salvation in Jesus is 100% a free gift of God that you could never earn or never get on your own. But as soon as you have accepted that gift, there is nothing in your life that is worth holding on to anymore. It will cost you everything, but my friends, look at me. It will cost you everything, but it is worth everything. It is priceless. There is nothing you could trade for following Jesus that is more valuable than following Jesus. There are some times when I'm going to buy a really valuable thing or something that's going to cost a lot of money that I want to make sure I buy the right thing. I do a ton of research on stuff before I buy expensive stuff. And a lot of times my litmus test for whether or not I should pull the trigger on something is I go to a friend that I know who owns that thing. And there are times, and really just a few certain people that I'll go to, that if they own that thing and they look at me and they tell me, hey man, I don't really know what the cost is. I don't know what it takes to actually get one of those things anymore, but I promise you it's worth it. If that friend who I trust and who I know looks at me and tells me whatever that item is that I'm searching for is worth it, I don't ask any questions. I think, okay, I'll go get it. It's worth it. If he says it's worth it, then I'm in, no matter what the cost is. I don't know what following Jesus is going to cost you in your life. I don't. I can't begin to imagine all the things that following Jesus might add up to in your life. It might cost you your job. It might cost you your comfort. It might cost you what you would consider your dream life. It may mean that you're persecuted. It may mean that you're not liked very much by the people that are in your office or around you. It might cost you your relationship with your parents. It might cost you your relationship with your kids. But listen to me, I don't know what it will cost you, but I promise, whatever the cost is to you, following Jesus is worth it. I promise that following Jesus is a treasure, and if you follow him and he calls you to give something up, or you follow him and he says, hey, I want you to step out here and it's gonna be uncomfortable and it's gonna be difficult and you might not like it that much and people around you might not like it that much, but here's the deal, if you choose to say yes, I promise to you that it is a priceless gift of infinite value that is worth whatever cost you might have to pay for it. Following Jesus is a treasure, and that treasure is in fact costly. But that treasure is priceless. That treasure is worth it. Sacrificing for something is actually only sad when you think about it if the thing you've sacrificed is more valuable than the thing you get on the other side of the sacrifice. But if you sacrifice something, if you give something up, if you pay a price for something and the thing that you get in return is more valuable than the thing that you gave up, then in the end you win. Then in the end, the cost that was associated with the sacrifice was worth it. I think for some of us, the cost that we're not willing to pay to follow Jesus is life his way. There are things maybe in your life and in my life that if we're really honest, we actually don't think that life Jesus' way is more valuable than the way that we want to live. We don't necessarily think that when Jesus tells us that he wants us to be generous, we don't necessarily think that's the best way. And so we hold on to money. We have greed maybe in our heart. Maybe we wouldn't call it greed, but we don't want to be generous the way that God would call us to be generous. I promise that when you hold on to the things in your life that are not what Jesus would say you are supposed to live, you are trading something that is not as valuable as life his way is. For some of us, man, we've had a pornography addiction that we haven't talked about for years because we actually kind of like it and we enjoy it, and we don't think that life the way Jesus would call us to live is more valuable than the thing we want to do right now. For some of us, we like to gossip. We like to talk about people. We actually think it's fun. We like to get the enjoyment out of it. We think, man, if I can feel a little bit better than they are in this moment, it's actually good for my life. But come on, the stuff that Jesus would tell us to give up is because he has something more valuable for us. You come to church and you do all the Christian stuff, but when the pressure's on, you drink just like everybody else. Do you believe that life in him and life his way is worth the cost? Because if it is a treasure, it might cost you a lot, but it's priceless. There's something that as we walk through this story and we read this parable, I actually think it's kind of ironic. When you actually dig at it and understand all that's going on, there's something that, I don't know, it's not that it doesn't make sense, but it's just some irony in the story. You can imagine Jesus sitting down, sharing this story with these people, talking about this hidden treasure, talking about this pearl that's worth so much. And really at the core of what Jesus is trying to do in this conversation, in this teaching, is he's trying to get people to see the value of following him. He's trying to get people to see how worth it he is. Jesus paints this beautiful picture of how life in him and life his way is really worth it. And he's trying to convince everybody that's there to give up their life, to lay it down, that he's promising that life his way and life in him is actually worth it. He spends his time and his energy trying to get the crowd to understand how worth it he is to them, how worth it he should be to them. And the ironic thing is that he spends all this time and this energy trying to get the people around him to see how much worth it he is for them in their life. But the people don't understand that Jesus is actually looking at them, and he knows that in a few short months, a few short weeks, he would actually be laying down his life for those very people, trying to get them to understand not only how worth it he is to have in his life, in our life, but actually how worth it you are to him. Jesus says, there's a lot of value in life with me. I promise you I am worth it. And the litmus test for whether or not he actually believed that is that he was willing to lay down his life for people who didn't see any worth in him because of how much worth he saw in them. In fact, here's what I want to say to wrap up this conversation, that to him, you are his treasure. You are his treasure. You are his treasure is not this idea that like you should get a big head about. It's not this, oh man, like I'm better than Jesus. I'm like, no. Jesus is trying to convince us that life in him and life his way is so valuable and so worth it that he was willing to lay down his life to prove that he was worth following. And to him, when he thinks about you, when he thinks about having relationship with you, when he thinks about making his kingdom available to you, he says, it is so worth it to me that I am willing to lay down my life in order that it might be an option for you to have. To him, you are his treasure. And someone who lays down their life for you, I don't think is lying to you. Someone who's willing to go to the cross to prove that he loves you, has something good in store for you. And the good that he has in store for you is himself, his kingdom, because his kingdom is a treasure. I want to give us an action step and maybe a homework assignment to think about, and I'm actually going to give us an option. Here's what I want you to do. I want you to choose one. Choose one of the things that I'm about to put on the screen. I'm going to give you two options. The first one that I want you to consider in this conversation is maybe you need to keep searching. Maybe when you think about the kingdom of heaven being a treasure and life his way and life in him being really valuable and actually worth it and something to consider in your life, maybe you got a lot of questions left. Maybe you got a lot of things you don't really understand about life in him and life his way. There's probably some stuff that you need to wrestle with and ask. My ask for you is that you'd keep searching. Maybe searching for you means you find someone that you're able to ask your questions to. Maybe searching for you is like, this is one of your very first times ever here at Grace, and you're like, why is this guy up on the stage yelling at me all the time? Maybe searching for you just means you keep coming back. You keep coming back. You keep learning more about what the kingdom of heaven looks like for you. But there are many of us in the room this weekend that we've understood the treasure. We see the value in Jesus. We've asked our questions. We've wrestled with it. We understand enough to know that Jesus really is a treasure. There's something that Jesus asks those of us who are followers of him to do to remind ourselves of how valuable the treasure in him is that I want to give us an opportunity to do here in a second. And that's take communion. Take communion. So if you're a follower of him, if you're someone who has given your life to him, if you've recognized that there is so much value and worth in your relationship with Jesus, I want us to pause in just a moment and take communion together. The night before Jesus was arrested, he got his key followers in a room together. And he sat down and he shared a meal with them. And during this meal, Jesus did something that to them would have felt very odd. It would have felt like something they had never really experienced before. But Jesus takes a little loaf of bread and a cup full of wine. And he gives them a symbolic thing that he actually wants them to repeat for the rest of their life. And it's something that the church still does today. Communion is this representation of understanding that the body of Jesus, the man who told the parable, the man who tried to convince people that life in him and life his way was worth it, wasn't just a teacher, he was ultimately a sacrifice. That he was willing to lay down his life to pay the price for your sin and my sin that separates us from him. So Jesus grabbed the bread that evening, much like we do today. And he said, I want you to take this. And as you eat, remember my sacrifice. Remember my body that was broken. Let's eat and remember the body of Christ. Jesus then grabbed a cup of wine, and he told his followers that night that it wasn't just his body that would be broken for them, it was his blood that would be shed. And that in his death and in the spilling of his blood, people's sins would be forgiven. And he said, when you drink this cup, remember my blood that was shed for you. Let's drink and remember. Father God, I thank you for who you are. God, it still blows my mind, though probably not as frequently as it should, that you even allow someone like me to be in relationship with you, that you have even made your kingdom available to me and to us in the first place. God, as we pause and we ponder over the parable that we read together, would we be blown away by how valuable life in you and life your way really is? That your kingdom is a treasure worth holding on to, a treasure worth giving everything for, a treasure that no cost is too great to receive. God, for those of us in the room who that treasure is still hidden, doesn't quite make sense yet, would we keep digging? Would we keep searching? Would we keep asking our questions? Would we keep reading and understanding who you are? Would we keep finding ourselves in communities of believers that love you and care about you? And God, for those of us who have maybe been followers of you who believe that life in you is a treasure, would we pull that treasure out and keep digging? Would we keep unearthing more of what life in you actually is all about and life your way really means? God, thank you for your word this weekend. Thank you for this parable. It's in your name we pray. Amen.